this is Julia. She just cleans houses.
Honestly, we've given up on her.
Wait, Julia Holloway? Your company operates in 14 states and cleans our buildings.
Julia Holloway had spent 10 years building a life her parents refused to see. Then, at her younger sister's engagement dinner, her mother smiled at the groom's family and introduced Julia as the daughter, who merely cleaned houses for a living. Her father made it even worse by announcing that they had given up on her. 23 guests sat around the beautifully decorated table. No one knew how to respond. Some looked down at their plates, while others forced uncomfortable smiles. But one woman did not smile at all. Catherine Ellsworth, the groom's mother, slowly put down her fork and stared at Julia. Catherine had seen Julia before. 18 months earlier, they had sat across from each other in a corporate boardroom. Catherine knew exactly who Julia was, and she knew the truth her parents had just tried to hide. To understand why that moment mattered so much, we have to go back 10 years. Julia grew up in the small town of Carver, Indiana. Her father, Gerald, had worked as a regional claims manager for the same insurance company for 3 decades. Her mother, Diane, had once been talented with numbers and had managed financial records for several small businesses. After becoming a mother, however, Diane left her career and never returned. Over time, Diane seemed to turn her buried disappointment into pressure on her daughters. She wanted them to achieve the respectable, polished success she believed she had sacrificed. Julia's younger sister, Paige, followed the expected path. She found a corporate marketing job, earned promotions, and collected the kind of achievements Diane loved displaying. Julia earned a business administration degree, but she did not follow her mother's plan. At 22, she rejected the MBA program Diane had selected for her and decided to start a commercial cleaning company. Julia did not make the decision carelessly. She had prepared a detailed business plan with market research, expenses, revenue forecasts, and a 12-month cash flow projection. Yet when she showed her parents, Diane did not even open the binder. She only heard the word, cleaning, and imagined her educated daughter scrubbing toilets. Gerald was equally dismissive. He was more upset that he had already told his coworkers Julia would pursue an MBA than interested in understanding her proposal. Diane then warned that if Julia wanted to clean floors, she would receive no family money. Only Julia's grandmother, Ruth, asked to see the plan. Ruth read every page and questioned Julia about her long-term goals. When she finished, she gave her granddaughter $800 from her savings. She also handed Julia a white cotton handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Ruth told her to keep it for the difficult days ahead. With that small investment and one person believing in her, Julia drove to Indianapolis. Her first apartment was a tiny studio with an unreliable radiator. She purchased an old white van that barely worked and found her first client, a dental office with 3 treatment rooms, a waiting area, and 1 bathroom. Every morning at 5, Julia cleaned the office herself. During the day, she visited businesses and asked for contracts. At night, she managed the accounts from her kitchen counter. The work was exhausting. Her shoulders hurt constantly, and she had no weekends. 6 months later, she had 4 contracts. By the end of the first year, the company had earned $62,000 in revenue, although only $11,000 remained as profit. Julia used that progress to hire her first employee, Maria, a hardworking single mother who never arrived late and never treated the job as unimportant. Maria would remain with Julia for the next decade and eventually become a regional manager. Every Sunday, Julia called Grandma Ruth. Ruth did not offer empty encouragement. She asked about clients, insurance, close rates, expenses, and future plans. Her questions made Julia feel that the business was real. Conversations with Julia's parents were different. Diane repeatedly asked when Julia would abandon the company and come home. Whenever Julia mentioned a small victory, her mother changed the subject to Paige's corporate career. Gerald rarely came to the phone. In the 3rd year, Julia secured a contract to clean a 12-story office building. The deal was worth $340,000 per year. She expanded into a second location, hired her 38th employee, and pushed annual revenue beyond $1.4 million. Excited, Julia called her mother and shared the news. Diane's response was not pride or curiosity. She simply asked how many people Julia now sent to mop floors. When Julia answered that she employed 38 people, Gerald immediately began talking about Paige's leadership program. That conversation became Julia's last attempt to make them understand. She did not announce that she was cutting them off. She simply stopped volunteering information to people who had already decided what she was. Her parents never looked at her company's website, professional profile, news coverage, or client list. For the next 7 years, they continued telling everyone that Julia cleaned houses. Meanwhile, Holloway Commercial Services grew rapidly. By the time Julia was 32, the company operated in 14 states, employed 283 people, served hospitals, universities, courthouses, corporate headquarters, and government buildings, and generated $18 million in annual revenue. Julia also built a respected employee training program with language support and maintained an 87% employee retention rate, one of the best in the industry. She had not merely created wealth. She had created stable work for hundreds of families and made sure the people performing essential cleaning services were treated with dignity. Then Paige called to announce her engagement to Garrett Ellsworth. His family would host a formal dinner, and Grandma Ruth specifically wanted Julia there. Julia searched Garrett's family name and immediately recognized it. Ellsworth Property Group managed hundreds of commercial properties. 18 months earlier, Holloway Commercial Services had won a contract to clean 47 of its buildings across 4 states. The agreement was worth $3.8 million annually, the largest contract in Julia's company's history. The contract had been approved by Catherine Ellsworth, Garrett's mother. Julia knew Catherine would probably recognize her at the dinner, but she made no plan to expose anyone. She agreed to attend because Ruth asked her to come. On the night of the dinner, Julia wore a simple navy blouse, black pants, flat shoes, and the gold chain Ruth had given her. She arrived at the elegant Birchwood restaurant and was greeted by Diane, who immediately inspected her modest outfit. Gerald shook Julia's hand instead of hugging her. Paige introduced her as an older sister who lived in Indianapolis, carefully avoiding any mention of work. Julia sat beside Ruth, now frail and using a wheelchair. Her grandmother took her hand and welcomed her warmly. As the guests arrived, Diane proudly introduced every relative with a title or achievement. A retired fire chief, a top nursing graduate, a successful professional. She moved past Julia without explanation. When Garrett's father, Robert, politely asked what Julia did, Diane answered before Julia could speak. She described it as residential cleaning and dismissed it as nothing special. Ruth squeezed Julia's hand beneath the table. Catherine arrived later. The moment she reached Julia, she paused. Recognition flashed across her face, but she calmly greeted Julia and continued around the table. For the next 20 minutes, she listened while Diane praised Paige and belittled Julia. During dinner, Gerald joked that Julia had started cleaning offices after college and that the family had expected the phase to end. Diane called Paige their shining star and described Julia only as someone who had taken a different, more hands-on path. The humiliation was not accidental. While Paige stepped away from the table, her phone lit up beside her plate. Julia saw a preview of the family's wedding planning group chat. Earlier that evening, Diane had warned Paige not to let Julia discuss her work, because the Ellsworths did not need to know their family included a cleaning lady. Paige had replied that she had already handled it by introducing Julia only as a sister from Indianapolis. That message changed something inside Julia. She realized the family had coordinated the deception. They were not simply uninformed. They were actively protecting themselves from the truth because Julia's work embarrassed them. Julia did not decide to create a scene. She made one quiet decision. If anyone asked her a direct question, she would stop shrinking and answer honestly. Before dessert, Diane stood and offered an emotional toast entirely devoted to Paige. She praised Paige's career, education, character, and future without mentioning Julia once. Robert finally interrupted to remind Diane that she had another daughter at the table. Forced to acknowledge her, Diane smiled and announced that Julia cleaned houses for a living. Gerald added that they had given up on her. No one laughed. Catherine slowly set down her fork and asked Julia to explain her cleaning work. Diane tried to answer for her, calling it ordinary housework, but Catherine firmly said she wanted to hear from Julia. Julia calmly explained that she owned a commercial cleaning company serving offices, hospitals, and universities. Catherine asked how many states the company covered. 14, Julia answered. Then Catherine asked how many people Julia employed. 283. The room went silent. Gerald's hand jerked. Paige turned toward Julia in disbelief. Garrett and his relatives stared, realizing that everything they had been told was false. Catherine reached into her purse, removed Julia's Navy business card, and placed it on the table in front of Diane. She then revealed the truth. Ellsworth Property Group had signed a $3.8 million annual contract with Julia's company. Julia herself had delivered the winning presentation to Catherine's board. Diane's face lost all color. Catherine explained that Julia had impressed the board not only with her business results, but with the care she showed for her employees. Julia's company had one of the best retention rates among Ellsworth's vendors and had become a trusted partner. Diane quickly claimed that Julia had never told them the company was so successful. Julia reminded her of the contracts and growth she had shared years earlier. Diane denied the conversation, but Ruth confirmed that she had heard it on speakerphone. Gerald claimed that parents were not mind readers. Julia answered that she had told them 3 times. They had stopped listening, so she had stopped talking. Robert said that if one of his children built an $18 million company, he would tell everyone in the room. Catherine agreed that Julia had created something extraordinary. Diane began crying and accused Julia of ruining Paige's engagement dinner. Paige initially repeated the same accusation, but Catherine stopped the manipulation with a simple observation: Julia had not started the conflict. Her mother had made false claims, and Julia had only answered questions. Facts were not drama. Diane pulled Julia into the hallway and accused her of arranging the humiliation. Julia refused to accept the blame. She had only arrived, sat down, and allowed the truth to exist in the same room as her mother's story. Diane then revealed the deeper wound behind her behavior. She spoke of everything had sacrificed for her family, her career and ambitions. Julia understood that her mother resented seeing a daughter choose her own path and succeed. Diane had given up her professional life and expected Julia to follow the safe blueprint she had designed. When Julia rejected it, Diane treated the decision as a personal betrayal. Julia told her mother that Diane's sacrifices had been her own choices, just as Julia's business had been hers. She would no longer allow her mother's regret to define her life. In another part of the hallway, Paige finally asked why Julia had never told her the truth. Julia asked when Paige had last shown real interest in her life. Paige could not answer. She had accepted Diane's version because it was convenient and had never bothered to investigate. Back at the table, Julia set a boundary. She said she loved her family and had spent 10 years loving them from a distance, because that was the only way she could breathe. She would continue answering Ruth's calls and showing up for her grandmother, but she would no longer attend events where her parents demanded that she appear smaller than she was. Diane protested that Julia could not simply leave because she was her mother. Julia calmly told her that motherhood required acting like a mother. Catherine urged Diane to recognize what her daughter had built. Ruth ordered Diane to sit down, and for once, Diane obeyed. Julia knelt beside Ruth and fixed the cardigan that had slipped from her grandmother's shoulder. Ruth told her that she did not need to stay. Julia had already come, and that was enough. Before Julia left, Ruth slipped a folded note into her hand. Julia then placed one business card beside Diane's plate and walked out without running or looking back. 11 miles later, Julia pulled into an empty church parking lot and opened Ruth's note. Her grandmother wrote that she had watched Julia create the life she once wished she had been brave enough to build. Diane had inherited Ruth's fear, but Julia had inherited her courage. Ruth told her not to wait for people determined not to see her. The right people already did. Julia cried over the steering wheel, holding the same handkerchief Ruth had given her 10 years earlier. In the following days, Diane left angry and emotional voicemails blaming Julia for the embarrassment. Gerald sent only a short message saying Diane was upset. Paige sent a different message. She apologized for never asking about Julia's life and requested a conversation that would be about the two sisters, not their mother. Catherine emailed Julia to reassure her that Holloway Commercial Services remained one of Ellsworth's most valued partners. Soon afterward, the company received an expedited 3-year contract extension with improved terms. 2 weeks later, Julia called Diane once. She said that she still loved her parents, but she would never again attend an event where they introduced her as less than she was. Diane accused her of choosing pride over family. Julia answered that she was choosing peace, which was not the same thing. 3 months passed. Diane and Gerald remained mostly silent. But in a small town, the truth traveled quickly. Relatives searched Julia's company online and found the website, the employee count, and the business articles Diane had ignored. For the first time, Diane could no longer control the family narrative. Paige eventually drove to Indianapolis. She and Julia were not instantly healed, but Paige began asking real questions. Julia left the door open because an honest, imperfect relationship was better than one built on their mother's version of reality. Catherine became both a friend and a valuable professional connection. She later referred a Michigan hospital group to Holloway Commercial Services, creating another major opportunity. Gerald eventually sent Julia one more message admitting that he should have spoken up at the dinner. Julia saved it, although she was not yet ready to respond. Ruth continued calling every Sunday. Her voice grew weaker, but her questions remained precise. She still wanted to know about Julia's employees, numbers, and future plans. Julia's parents had said she cleaned houses, and in one sense, that was true. Julia's company cleaned hospitals where children recovered, courthouses where justice was pursued, universities where students prepared for the future, and offices where careers were built. There was nothing small or shameful about that work. The mistake was never the word, cleaning. The mistake was the word, just. There is no just in starting with $800 and building an $18 million company. There is no just in providing stable jobs to 283 people. There is no just in performing essential work with excellence and dignity. Julia finally understood that success could not force people to respect her if they were committed to misunderstanding her. She no longer needed to perform, explain, or shrink herself in search of approval. Her greatest inheritance was not money. It was the courage Ruth saw in her before anyone else did. The courage to build something from nothing, to walk away from disrespect, and to choose peace without confusing it with surrender.